Chapter 1. The Body in the Blue Room. London, March 1937. There are galleries, and then there is Whitfield and Sons. The distinction was not merely one of quality, though quality was certainly present in abundance. The ceilings were high enough to suggest the divine. The floors were polished to a reflectivity that made visitors feel they were walking on preserved water. And the lighting had been arranged by an expert who understood that art, like crime, reveals its truest nature only in precisely calibrated illumination. No, the distinction was of history. Whitfield and Sons had stood on Dover Street since 1841, surviving 2 queens, 1 king, 1 world war, and the occasional scandal with the composed dignity of an institution that regarded the passage of time as merely confirmatory of its own importance.
On the evening of the 12th of March, Whitfield and Sons held its annual Spring Gala, an event that had occupied the same slot in the London social calendar for 60 years, inviting the same stratum of society that had always attended, now accompanied by their children and occasionally their grandchildren, all dressed in their best and all under the impression that they had come to look at paintings. They had not come to look at paintings. They had come to be seen looking at paintings, which is a different activity entirely and considerably more complicated. Hercule Poirot had come at the insistence of his neighbour, a retired diplomat named Sir Geoffrey Marsh, who had the season tickets and the inclination to use them and the particular capacity of the very old for making requests that it was impossible to refuse without also refusing to be a decent human being. Poirot had therefore dressed with his customary precision, the patent leather shoes, the carefully tended moustaches, the evening coat that his tailor in Jermyn Street had produced to specifications that no other tailor in London would have considered sane, and had arrived at 8:30 to find the gallery already full of the kinds of people who arrive early to events at which arriving early is considered a statement. He had been examining a small watercolour, a Cotman, genuinely lovely, with the clean atmospheric washes that the Norwich school had perfected, for approximately 6 minutes when the scream came.
It came from the Blue Room. The Blue Room was at the far end of Whitfield and Sons' ground floor, separated from the main gallery by a panelled corridor and a set of double doors currently standing open. It was so named for its walls, which were hung with a deep Prussian blue silk, that the current Mr. Whitfield, the 4th of that name to run the gallery, believed showed oil paintings to their best advantage. It contained tonight 12 works of the Dutch and Flemish schools and 1 dead man. The dead man was Mr. Oliver Whitfield himself. He was lying on the parquet floor of the Blue Room, face downward, in the manner of someone who has fallen rather than been arranged. The back of his head showed a wound of the kind produced by a hard, blunt object applied with considerable force. Near his outstretched right hand lay a small bronze figurine, a Mercury, copied from the classical, about 10 inches in height, and it was immediately apparent, from the condition of its base, that this was the instrument. Inspector Raymond Doyle of Scotland Yard, who had been attending the gala as the guest of a friend in the art trade, and who was therefore present in dinner clothes rather than his professional capacity, was already crouching beside the body when Poirot arrived at the double doors. Doyle looked up. He had a young, alert face, dark-haired, with the particular expression of a man who is rapidly recalculating the evening's agenda. "Monsieur Poirot," he said. Not surprised exactly. Resigned, perhaps.
In the manner of someone who has begun to understand that Poirot's presence at events of this kind is not coincidental but structural, that wherever Poirot goes, the machinery of murder seems eventually to make itself known. "Inspector Doyle," said Poirot. He stepped carefully into the Blue Room, avoiding the spreading edge of what he had identified as blood, and looked at the paintings on the walls. Then he looked at the man on the floor. Then he looked with particular attention at the empty bracket on the south wall, a wrought iron bracket of the kind used to hold a spotlight, currently holding nothing, from which a single wire dangled. "The figurine," said Poirot. "It was placed there, near his hand, after he fell."
The blood pattern is wrong for it to have been where it lies when he was struck. Doyle looked at the figurine.
Looked at the blood. Looked at Poirot. "You're certain?" "I am always certain," said Poirot, with the serenity of a man for whom this is simply factual. "Which means we are not looking for the object that killed Mr. Whitfield. We are looking for something else, something that struck him from above and from behind, and which someone has since removed." He looked at the empty bracket. "Something that was hanging there." "What was hanging there?" said Doyle. Poirot turned to survey the room, the 12 Dutch and Flemish works, each in their positions, each lit from above by their individual spots. He counted the brackets, he counted the paintings. "That," he said quietly, "is the first question. And I suspect that whoever can answer it has also answered several others." He moved toward the double doors.
"The guests must not be permitted to leave, Inspector, all of them. And I should very much like to speak to Mr. Whitfield's son. I understand young Mr. Frederick Whitfield was present this evening, and to the gallery's head of restoration, and to a woman in a green dress who was standing in the doorway of this room not 3 minutes before the scream, whom I noticed, and who has since disappeared from the immediate vicinity." Doyle was already on his feet, already reaching for the small notebook he kept even in his dinner jacket, because 20 years of police work had made it as natural as breathing. What did she look like? Poirot considered. 40, perhaps. Dark hair, simply dressed. The green dress was not expensive, but it was well chosen. She wore no jewelry except one ring. Here. He touched his right index finger. And she was not looking at the paintings. She was looking at the people looking at the paintings. He went out of the Blue Room and back into the main gallery, where the assembled Spring Gala of Whitfield and Sons stood in the particular suspended animation of people who have heard a scream and are waiting to be told what it means. Les petites cellules grises, Poirot reflected, were already working, already turning over the first pieces, already sensing the shape of the thing beneath the surface. He smoothed his moustaches. He looked at the room. He began. Chapter 2. The Whitfield Inheritance. Frederick Whitfield was 28 years old and looked, at this particular moment, approximately 45. He had his father's build, tall, broad-shouldered, yet the kind of physicality that English public schools produced and English business careers gradually softened. But his mother's colouring, which was fair and fine-boned and currently drained of all colour, to a quality approaching translucence. He sat in his father's office, a room at the back of the ground floor, lined with correspondence files and Christie's catalogues, and the accumulated administrative sediment of a gallery that had been doing business since the reign of Queen Victoria. And he held a glass of brandy that someone had thoughtfully provided and that he had not yet drunk. Poirot sat across the desk from him. Inspector Doyle stood near the door. "When did you last see your father alive?" said Poirot. Frederick looked at his hands. "At 8:45, perhaps 8:50. He was in the main gallery. He was speaking with Mr. Hartmann, Heinrich Hartmann, the German collector. They were discussing the Ruysdael landscape. Father had been trying to sell it to Hartmann for 3 months. And you left them together?" "I moved on. There were other guests. I had my own. I have responsibilities at the gala, introductions to make, people to look after." He paused. "Father preferred to manage the significant clients himself." "The relationship between you and your father," said Poirot, in the careful tone of a man introducing a subject he knows is loaded. "Was it harmonious?" A pause. Not a long pause, but the specific kind, the fraction of a second in which a person decides between the truth they have prepared and the truth that actually exists. "It was a working relationship," said Frederick. "We didn't always agree on the gallery's direction. Father was traditional. He had run the gallery for 35 years in a particular way, and he saw no reason to change. I have different ideas about what the gallery could be. More modern, more international." He set down the brandy. "We disagreed, frequently, but it was business disagreement, not personal." "And the inheritance?" said Poirot pleasantly. Frederick looked at him sharply. "I beg your pardon?" "The gallery. Under the terms of Mr. Whitfield's will,
which I assume exists, given the nature of the business. Who inherits it? A silence. Inspector Doyle's pencil moved quietly. There were discussions, said Frederick, about the succession. Father had consulted solicitors.
There was a question about whether the gallery should pass to me or whether it should be restructured, brought into partnership with another dealer. He paused. With Hartmann, as it happens. Poirot was very still. Your father was considering selling the gallery to Heinrich Hartmann. A partnership, 40%. Enough to change the character of the place. Enough to change the name eventually. Frederick's jaw set. I was opposed. I made my opposition clear. And your father's position? He was considering it seriously. Hartmann's money is considerable. His connections in Germany and Austria give access to works that we can't otherwise obtain. He stopped. Or couldn't, previously. Poirot absorbed this. He looked at the bookcases, the files, the framed photographs on the wall. 4 generations of Whitfields.
The gallery in its various incarnations, a lineage of possession and continuity. Tell me about the blue room, he said. The bracket on the south wall, the empty one. What was hanging there? Frederick frowned. Hanging? A spotlight, I assume. They're all... Not a spotlight. The spotlight bracket was there, but empty. Something else had been attached to it. Something that has since been removed. Poirot watched him carefully. Think, Mr. Whitfield. The blue room is your father's particular domain, is it not? He curated it personally. He chose each work. He arranged each light. Something moved behind Frederick's eyes, not guilt, but recognition. The recognition of someone for whom a small, previously unremarkable detail has suddenly acquired significance. There was a mirror, he said slowly, an antique mirror. Venetian?
The 18th century, small oval. Father had it hung on that bracket for a specific purpose. He said it helped viewers see the Dutch works from a different angle, that the reflection changed the light. He paused. I always thought it was an eccentricity. When was it put there? It's been there for 2 years, perhaps. 2.5. And is it valuable? Frederick blinked. The mirror itself, moderately. £200–300 at auction. Nothing remarkable. Nothing remarkable, repeated Poirot thoughtfully. He rose, taking his hat. Mr. Whitfield, who, besides your father, had a key to the gallery after hours. Myself. Mrs. Crane, the head of restoration. Jenkins, the night watchman. And... He stopped. And? Said Poirot. And Hartmann, said Frederick. Father gave him a key 3 weeks ago.
As a gesture of good faith, toward the partnership. Poirot nodded once, with the air of a man for whom a second piece has just found its position. Outside, the March night pressed against the windows of Dover Street, and somewhere in the gallery, in the blue room with its Prussian blue walls and its 12 Dutch masterworks and its 1 empty bracket, the shape of what had happened was becoming, to Poirot's increasingly engaged mind, clearer with every conversation. Not clearer in the way of certainty, not yet, but clearer in the way of a fog that is beginning, in patches, to lift. Chapter 3. The Woman in the Green Dress. She had not, in fact, disappeared. Poirot found her in the small anteroom adjacent to the main gallery, a room intended for the storage of exhibition materials and currently containing 6 rolled canvases, as a stack of framing supplies, a catalogue of the Spring Gala, and 1 woman in a green dress, sitting very quietly on a packing case, with her hands in her lap, and the expression of someone who has decided to stop running and see what happens next. Her name was Mrs. Clara Voss. She was 41. She was the widow of a German art dealer named Ernst Voss, who had died in Munich in 1934, under circumstances that the German authorities had recorded as cardiac arrest, and that everyone who had known Ernst Voss understood perfectly well had been nothing of the kind. She told Poirot this with the directness of a woman who has decided that the geography of her situation leaves no room for evasion. She told it quietly, without drama,
in the accented English of someone who had spoken the language for 20 years and had never quite lost the cadences of her first one. and she watched Poirot as she spoke with the quality of a person assessing not whether to trust, but how far to trust. A calculation, Poirot understood, that she had been performing continuously for 3 years and had become very good at. "You were watching the guests," said Poirot, "not the paintings. When I saw you in the doorway of the Blue Room, you were watching the people." "I was looking for someone," she said. "Heinrich Hartmann." A pause. "Yes." "You knew him in Germany." "My husband knew him in Germany," she said. "Heinrich Hartmann is a man who moves through the art world the way certain fish move through water, smoothly, without apparent effort, and eating as he goes, everything smaller than himself." She looked at her hands. "My husband was smaller than himself." "Tell me about the mirror," said Poirot. She looked up sharply. The ring on her right index finger, a gold band with a small dark stone, caught the light as her hand moved. "The mirror," she said carefully. "The Venetian mirror that hung in the Blue Room. The one that is now missing, the one that is, I believe, why you are in London and why you were at this gala tonight." A long silence. In the main gallery beyond the anteroom, Poirot could hear the subdued sounds of people being kept in a place they wished to leave. The murmur of conversation, the occasional raised voice, the patient sounds of Inspector Doyle managing the situation with the competence of a man who had been doing it for 2 decades. "Ernst found it," she said finally. "In 1932, in Vienna, at an estate sale. He knew immediately what it was." She paused. "It looks like a mirror, Monsieur Poirot. An antique mirror with a carved frame. Venetian, as you say, 18th century genuinely, the frame is authentic. But the glass?" "The glass," said Poirot quietly. "The glass is not original. It was replaced, in 1919 we believe, by a man named Kessler, who worked for an Austrian bank that was in the process of managing the assets of families who were no longer in a position to manage them themselves." She stopped. "Behind the mirror glass, between the replacement glass and the original frame backing, there are documents, affidavits, account records, transfer documents, records of 67 transactions conducted between 1919 and 1923, records that name individuals, institutions, and the works that passed between them." She looked at Poirot steadily. "Records that prove, with the precision of a bank ledger, that Heinrich Hartmann's entire collection, everything he has acquired in 20 years of dealing, was built on works stolen from Jewish families in Austria and Germany." The anteroom was very quiet. "Your husband discovered this," said Poirot. "Ernst discovered it. He copied several of the documents. He began to make inquiries." She paused. "He died in 1934, cardiac arrest." "And the mirror?" "Sold. Ernst's estate was complicated. His assets were dispersed. The mirror was sold at auction in Berlin in 1935 to a London buyer." She paused. "To Oliver Whitfield, who may or may not have known what it contained," said Poirot. "I don't know what Whitfield knew," she said. "I came to find out." "I came to try to recover the mirror through negotiation, if possible, to recover the documents inside it." "And Hartmann," said Poirot. "Did he know the mirror was here?" She looked at him with smoke-grey eyes that had seen a great deal and retained most of it. "I believe," she said carefully, "that Hartmann has known for some time. I believe he has been trying to acquire the mirror through Whitfield, which is perhaps why he was so interested in a partnership with the gallery. A partnership would give him access to everything Whitfield owned," she paused, "including items not in the public catalogue." Poirot rose. He looked at her for a moment, this careful, patient, 3 years running woman who had come to London to recover something that had killed her husband, armed with nothing but knowledge and the absolute, specific courage of someone who has nothing left to lose. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I want you to stay in this room. I want you to speak to no one else tonight, and I want you to understand that I am going to find that mirror, and that, when I do, the documents it contains will go to the appropriate authorities through legitimate channels in a manner that cannot be suppressed." He paused. "Can you trust me with that?" She looked at him for a long moment.
I have trusted people before, she said. It has not always served me well. No, said Poirot. I imagine it has not. He picked up his hat. But I am not most people, and this— He gestured, a small precise movement that somehow encompassed the whole evening. The dead man, the missing mirror,
the German collector with his smooth manner and his terrible collection. This will not end the way the other things have ended. He left her on the packing case. In the corridor outside, the sounds of the constrained gala continued, and in Poirot's mind, Les Petites Cellules Grises moved with the quiet, purposeful energy of something that has found its scent. Chapter 4. The Dealer and the Documents. Heinrich Hartmann received Poirot in the main gallery with the composed authority of a man who has decided to occupy territory rather than concede it. He was standing before the Ruisdael landscape, a large stately Dutch work depicting the approach of a storm over a flat northern plain, with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression of careful, calibrated grief that Poirot examined with the attention he gave to all things artfully constructed. He was 60, Hartmann, heavy-set, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and had settled, over decades, into an authority that was perhaps more effective. He wore his evening clothes with the ease of a man who had been wearing them since his 30s and had never thought about it since. His English was excellent, the English of a man who had done a great deal of business in England and who understood that the language, deployed correctly, was itself a kind of social credential. "A terrible evening," he said as Poirot approached. He shook his head slowly, looking at the Ruisdael. "Oliver and I had known each other for 15 years. A genuine, I think, genuine friendship."
"Not only business. 15 years, said Poirot. "And the partnership, the proposed acquisition of 40% of Whitfield and Sons, that was recent?" "We had been discussing it for 6 months. It was proceeding very well." "And Frederick Whitfield's opposition to the arrangement?" Hartmann waved a large hand, a dismissive gesture, perfectly calibrated. "Young Frederick is protective of the family name. It is understandable, but Oliver understood that the gallery needed new capital, new connections. The world is changing." He paused. "Was changing." "The key," said Poirot. "Mr. Whitfield gave you a key to the gallery 3 weeks ago." Hartmann turned to look at him directly. His eyes were light grey, steady, the colour of a sky before rain. As a gesture of trust. Oliver was old-fashioned in certain ways. For him,
"A key was a symbol, a commitment. And did you use it? In the 3 weeks since he gave it to you?" A pause. "I came by once in the daytime to examine a work in storage that Oliver wanted my opinion on. Jenkins the watchman was present." "Only once?" "Only once." The light grey eyes held Poirot's without wavering. This was a man, Poirot noted, who had been asked uncomfortable questions before and had developed the specific technique of answering them with the truth. Because the truth, in the areas where the truth was safe, was always more convincing than a lie. "Tell me about the Blue Room," said Poirot. "The Venetian mirror that was hung in there, you were aware of it?" Something happened in the light grey eyes. It was very small, a contraction, a fraction of a second's recalculation, and then it was gone, replaced by the composed authority. "I noticed it, yes. A charming piece. Decorative." "Only decorative?" "What else would a mirror be?" said Hartmann pleasantly. Poirot looked at him with the mild, relentless gaze that had seen through a great many performances in a long career. "Mr. Hartmann," he said, "I shall tell you what I know, and you shall tell me where I am wrong, if I am wrong." He paused. "I know that the mirror in the Blue Room contained documents behind its glass. I know that those documents relate to our transactions conducted between 1919 and 1923 in Vienna and Munich. I know that among the names in those documents is your own. And I know that a man is dead tonight, and that the mirror is missing, and that you have had a key to this gallery for 3 weeks." Hartmann was very still. "These are serious allegations," he said. His voice had lost its social ease. It was still controlled, but it was controlled now
in the manner of something under pressure rather than something at rest. "They are observations," said Poirot. "I make no allegation. I observe that you were here tonight. I observe that you were the last person seen speaking with Mr. Whitfield before he was found dead. I observe that the instrument of death has been removed from the scene by someone who knew what they were doing, and that you are a man who knows what he is doing." He paused. "And I observe that you look at this moment like a man who is trying to determine how much I know and whether it is enough." Hartmann looked at him for a long time. "I want to speak to my solicitor," he said. "You are entirely welcome to do so," said Poirot. "Inspector Doyle will assist you with that. However," he paused at the edge of turning away, as though an afterthought had occurred to him, "I should mention that the documents I described to you are not, in fact, inside the mirror at this moment." Hartmann's composure fractured, very slightly, very briefly, but Poirot saw it. "Where are they?" said Hartmann. Poirot smiled, a small, precise smile. "That," he said, "is the interesting question, isn't it?" He left Hartmann standing before the Ruisdael, before its painted storm on its painted plain, with the look of a man who has just been informed that the thing he came to find is not where he left it. In the corridor, Doyle fell into step beside him. "He did it," said Doyle. "He is one of several people with reasons to have done it," said Poirot carefully. "Which is not the same thing." He walked toward the stairs. "I need to speak to Mrs. Crane, the head of restoration." "Why restoration?" "Because someone removed a mirror from a bracket in the Blue Room, either immediately before or immediately after committing a murder, and replaced the bracket as though the mirror had never been there. That is not the act of a frightened person acting in haste." Poirot paused. "That is the act of someone who knows what things look like when they have been properly managed. And who manages things in this gallery?" Doyle looked at him. "The head of restoration," said Doyle. "Précisément," said Poirot. Chapter 5. The restorer's art. Mrs. Edith Crane had been the head of restoration at Whitfield and Sons for 19 years.
Which meant she had served under Oliver Whitfield for practically her entire professional career, and had the relationship with the gallery that long service produces. Intimate, complicated, and not entirely reducible to any simple description of loyalty or employment. She was 53, with the careful hands and the exacting eyes of someone whose profession demanded that she see things as they actually were, rather than as they were represented to be. She was found by Poirot in the restoration studio on the first floor, a long, well-lit room smelling of linseed oil and chemical solvents and the particular compound smell of old paint and new intervention. Sitting at her work table with her hands flat on the surface and the expression of a woman who has been waiting with professional patience for someone to come and ask her the correct questions. Poirot sat down across from her. "The mirror," he said. "Yes," she said, "just that." Not a question, not a denial, not the preliminary architecture of an evasion, just the one word, with the quality of a door opening inward. "Tell me," said Poirot. She told him. She had known about the mirror's contents for 11 months, since April of the previous year, when a hairline crack in the frame had required attention, and she had, in the process of the repair, discovered the anomaly in the glass thickness. She had examined it carefully, in the manner of her profession, methodically, thoroughly, without jumping to conclusions, and had determined that the glass was a replacement, fitted with considerable skill over a backing that was thicker than it should have been. She had not told Oliver Whitfield immediately. This was the point at which Poirot listened with particular attention. "Why not?" he said. "Because I needed to understand what I had found," she said. "Because acting without understanding is contrary to everything I practice. You don't touch a painting before you understand it. You don't intervene before you know what you're intervening in." She paused. "And because I was not certain, at first, that Oliver hadn't already known." "And was he aware?" She was quiet for a moment. "I told him in January, 2 months ago. I explained what I had found. I showed him the copies of the documents that I had carefully made, with a camera, before putting everything back exactly as I had found it." She looked at her hands.
His response was, "Not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I expected shock or guilt, that he had unknowingly purchased something so burdened, or the practical response of a businessman working out what to do with an inconvenient discovery." She paused. "What I got was calculation. He saw it immediately as leverage, as a negotiating tool. He said Hartman had been pressuring him about the partnership, offering terms that were less favorable each month, as though he knew Whitfield needed the money more than he was willing to admit. And now—" she stopped. "And now he had something Hartman very much needed not to become public," said Poirot. "Yes." She said it with the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent 2 months being implicated in something they did not design and could not prevent. "And tonight," said Poirot, "tonight Whitfield intended to confront Hartman, to use the documents as the opening move in a renegotiation. 40% would become 20, or nothing." She looked at Poirot directly. "He told me this afternoon. He seemed energized by it. He had the look of a man who believes he has regained the upper hand." "And the mirror?" "He moved it," she said quietly. "This afternoon. He took it from the blue room bracket himself and put it somewhere. He didn't tell me where. He said only that it was safe, and that after tonight's conversation with Hartman, he would know what to do with it." "He moved it himself?" said Poirot. "Not you?" "Not me." "And you did not know where he had put it?" "No." She paused. "I looked after they told me he was dead. I went to the blue room, and the bracket was empty. Yes, as you apparently observed. I looked in his office, in the storage room on this floor. I couldn't find it." Poirot nodded slowly. He looked at the restoration studio, the long tables, the paintings in various stages of attention, the racks of tools and chemicals, the precise ordered world of someone who spent their professional life rescuing things that had been damaged. "Mrs. Crane," he said, "the documents you copied, you still have the copies." "Yes." "And they are— where?" A long pause. "Safe," she said, with a quality in the word that told Poirot this was the truth and that she had decided, some time ago, where safe was and how to ensure it remained so. "Good," said Poirot simply. He rose. He looked at the paintings on the restoration tables, works in various states of cleaning and repair,
their true colours emerging from beneath the accumulated darkening of years. It was, he reflected, not an entirely dissimilar process to the one he himself was engaged in tonight. "One question," he said. "The bronze Mercury, the figurine found near the body. It was not the weapon, but it was placed there deliberately, which means someone knew it was in the blue room." He paused. "Who else knew the blue room's contents well enough to choose that specific object as a decoy?" Edith Crane looked at him. "Frederick," she said. "Frederick Whitfield knew every object in this gallery. He grew up here." "Yes," said Poirot. "He did." He went back down the stairs, and as he descended, the picture that had been forming in his mind acquired, in the space of those 20 steps, the final quality that distinguishes a picture that is nearly right from a picture that is entirely right. It was not one person. It was not two. It was the oldest structure in the repertoire of human crimes. A situation in which two separate people had arrived independently at the same conclusion about the same man, and had acted on it in the same evening, each unaware of the other. Or so each believed. The question was what had actually happened, in what order, in those 40 minutes in the blue room, while the Spring Gala continued its oblivious social choreography in the rooms beyond. Poirot reached the ground floor, straightened his cuffs, and went to find Inspector Doyle. Chapter 6. The Rearranged Evening. They gathered the evidence in the way that Poirot preferred, methodically, in sequence,
without the shortcuts that produced the wrong answer efficiently. Inspector Doyle had kept the guests in the main gallery with the patience and firmness of a man who understood that inconvenience was the price of accuracy. By midnight, 37 statements had been taken by the 4 constables who had arrived in the hour after the discovery. By 1 in the morning, the picture of the evening had been assembled with sufficient clarity to begin the process of triangulation. of laying the statements against each other and examining where they aligned and where they diverged and what the divergences revealed. Poirot and Doyle sat in Oliver Whitfield's office with the statements spread across the desk and a pot of coffee that one of the gallery staff had produced at some point, and that was now cold. "The timeline," said Poirot.
Doyle consulted his notes. Whitfield was last seen alive by multiple witnesses at approximately 8:50, speaking with Hartman in the main gallery before the Ruisdael. At 9:15, Mrs. Crane went to the restoration studio on the first floor. At 9:20, Frederick Whitfield was seen by two guests in the anteroom, the one where we found Mrs. Voss, apparently looking for something. "Looking for something," repeated Poirot. His words to the guests were, quote, "Have you seen the catalogue for the Blue Room section? I seem to have mislaid mine, which may or may not be accurate." "It is not accurate," said Poirot. "But continue." Between 9:20 and 9:40, we have a gap in Hartman's movements. Three guests recall seeing him in the main gallery before 9:20. The next confirmed sighting is 9:42.
When he was observed by two people near the entrance hall. Doyle paused. 22 minutes. "Sufficient," said Poirot. "The Blue Room is 90 seconds' walk from the entrance hall. 22 minutes is more than sufficient for what was done there." "Frederick Whitfield's movements during the same period are also unaccounted for," said Doyle. "He re-emerges, confirmed, at 9:35, speaking to a guest near the main gallery bar. But between 9:20 and 9:35, nothing definite." 15 minutes, said Poirot. "Also sufficient." He looked at the statements. "And the scream? At precisely what time?" 9:51. "Lady Ashworth, the woman who screamed, is very precise about it. She checked her watch immediately upon finding the body."
Having read somewhere that accurate timekeeping is important in emergencies. Poirot was quiet for a moment. "So," he said, "between 8:50, the last confirmed sighting of Oliver Whitfield alive, and 9:51, the discovery of the body, we have 1 hour and 1 minute, during which time at minimum 2 people were in the Blue Room at points that are unaccounted for." He picked up his magnifying glass from the desk where he had placed it earlier. "Let us construct the evening, Doyle, not as people have described it, as it actually occurred." He set the glass down on the largest clear space of the desk and began to move statements around it, grouping them, separating them, examining the overlaps. "Oliver Whitfield," said Poirot, "took the Venetian mirror from the Blue Room earlier today and hid it somewhere in the gallery.
He then attended his own Spring Gala with the intention of confronting Hartman and using the mirror's contents as leverage." He paused. "Between 8:50 and, let us say, 9:20, he was in the main gallery. He spoke to Hartman about the Ruisdael, but did not, at that point, produce his real agenda. He was waiting for the right moment." "Why wait?" said Doyle. "Because Oliver Whitfield was a man who had run a gallery for 35 years and understood presentation. He would not raise the subject in the main gallery, in public, in front of 37 witnesses. He would arrange a private moment." Poirot moved 2 statements side by side. "The Blue Room, perhaps? He would have asked Hartman to follow him, to see something, to discuss the sale of a work, and then, in private, he would have presented his case." Doyle was quiet, following the logic. "But something went wrong," said Doyle. "Something went wrong," said Poirot. "In the Blue Room, whatever Whitfield said or showed to Hartman, the conversation became, let us say, physical. The mercury was near. Hartman struck him. And then Hartman, who is a man of great practical intelligence and considerable self-possession, Hartman removed the actual weapon from the scene. Not the mercury. He placed the mercury to mislead. He removed whatever he had actually used." "The mirror?" said Doyle. Poirot paused. "Possibly, if Whitfield had produced the mirror in the Blue Room to demonstrate that the documents were real. Then Hartman, after the blow, would have taken it immediately." He looked at the desk. "But here is the complication.
A Frederick Whitfield was also in the vicinity of the Blue Room at 9:20. Frederick, who knew the Blue Room intimately, who knew the mercury was there, who had strong reasons of his own to wish his father dead. You think Frederick also went to the Blue Room? I think, said Poirot carefully, that Frederick arrived in the Blue Room and found something he did not expect. Not his father alive, but not his father as we found him either. I think there was an interval. He rose and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. Frederick Whitfield went to the Blue Room at approximately 9:20 with his own intentions. What he found there altered those intentions, and what he did in response to what he found, that is the piece I am still assembling. Doyle looked at him. You think he found his father already dead? I think, said Poirot slowly, turning from the window, that Frederick Whitfield found his father dying, not yet dead, and that the choice he made in that moment, the choice between calling for help and waiting, will tell us everything we need to know about the character of this family's tragedy. He looked at Doyle. Tomorrow morning, he said, we will need to speak to Frederick Whitfield again. And this time, we will need to ask him what his father said to him in those final minutes. You think Whitfield spoke to him? A man doesn't spend 35 years building something, said Poirot, without, in the last moment of his life, having something to say about it. He picked up his coat. Outside, Dover Street was quiet under the late March sky.
And the spring that was supposed to have arrived was still, like so many things this evening, somewhere in the process of becoming. Chapter 7. What the Dying Man Said. Frederick Whitfield came to the gallery at 9 the following morning with the look of a man who has spent the night deciding whether or not to tell the truth and has arrived at a conclusion that cost him something. He sat in his father's office. It was his office now, technically, in the abrupt legal sense that death produces. And he sat straight-backed, with his hands on the desk in front of him, and he looked at Poirot with the particular expression of someone who is about to surrender something heavy. I was there, he said. I know, said Poirot. I went to find him. I had found out, earlier that afternoon, I overheard a conversation between father and Mrs.
Crane. I understood what the mirror contained, and I understood what father intended to do with it. He paused. He intended to use it as a weapon against Hartman, yes. But not only as a weapon, as a foundation. He intended to complete the partnership anyway. He thought that having the documents gave him permanent control over Hartman's behavior, a permanent advantage. And you found this unacceptable, said Poirot. I found it monstrous, said Frederick, with a sudden quiet intensity that was more convincing than any performance could have been. Those documents, if they are what Mrs. Crane described, they represent the theft of dozens of works from dozens of families. Using them as personal leverage rather than surrendering them to the authorities is compounding the original crime.
And I was not prepared to stand by and watch my father do that with the gallery's name attached to it. So you went to the Blue Room, said Poirot. I went to the Blue Room at 9:20, as you apparently know. He swallowed. The doors were slightly open. I could hear. There were voices. Father and Hartman. I stopped in the corridor. I didn't go in immediately. A pause. I should have gone in immediately. What did you hear? Hartman denying everything. Father pressing him. Father said he had the mirror, that he had moved it that afternoon to a safe location, and that Hartman would not find it without Father's cooperation. And then he stopped. And then, said Poirot, and then it became very quiet. And then there was a sound, not loud, not the kind of sound I would have expected. Just a sound. His hands tightened on the desk surface. I opened the doors. Father was on the floor. Hartman was standing over him, holding what I now believe was a heavy torch. A small, heavy torch, the kind the staff use for examining works in inadequate light. Father had been struck from behind. Doyle, who was standing near the wall, wrote steadily, without looking up. Hartman saw you, said Poirot. He heard me, the doors. He turned, and then he did something I did not expect. He put the torch in his coat pocket, straightened himself, and said, perfectly calmly, he said, Your father has had an accident. Call for help immediately, and say you found him like this. And he walked past me, into the corridor. And you? Said Poirot quietly. Frederick looked at his hands for a long moment. Father was still alive.
Barely. He was trying to speak. I knelt down. I held his hand. I said I was calling for help. He paused. He said, the mirror is in the fourth drawer of the plan chest in the studio. Tell Edith. And then he was no longer conscious. And you did not immediately raise the alarm. The question sat between them. No, I didn't. Frederick's voice was low. I sat with him for several minutes. I was in shock, I think. And there was another thing, something that I am ashamed of. He looked up. For perhaps 90 seconds, I thought about what would happen if I waited, if I let him, if I didn't call for help immediately. There would be no partnership with Hartman, no documents used as leverage. The gallery would revert to me cleanly. He stopped. I did not act on it. I went immediately to find help. But the thought was there, and I cannot pretend it wasn't. The office was very quiet. The gap in the timeline, said Poirot. The 15 minutes between 9:20 and 9:35. I was with him, said Frederick. Some of the time in the blue room, some of the time in the corridor outside, trying to compose myself enough to be useful. And the torch, Hartman's weapon. He took it with him. I didn't see it again. Poirot rose and moved to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. Frederick, your father said the mirror was in the plant chest in the studio. Is it still there? I checked this morning. It is. Good. Poirot looked at him steadily. What you have told me this morning required a considerable degree of courage. It implicates you in a manner that is uncomfortable and in a manner that will need to be formally addressed. He paused. But it is the truth. And the truth in matters of this kind is the only workable foundation. He paused once more. The documents in that mirror will go to the international authorities today. Everything that follows from that will take time, years perhaps, but it will proceed. He looked at Frederick with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite severity, but was somewhere between the two, where accuracy lives. And the gallery, what will happen to it? Frederick looked around the office, the files, the catalogues, the 4 generations of photographs. It will remain what it was meant to be, he said, or I will close it. Poirot nodded once. He went to find Inspector Doyle and Heinrich Hartmann.
In that order. Hartmann was still on the premises. Technically, he had been asked to remain, and a man of his intelligence understood that leaving would constitute a statement of its own. He was in the entrance hall, seated on the bench beside the catalogue table, with the composed expression of a man who has prepared several contingency responses and is waiting to deploy whichever seems most appropriate. When Poirot told him that Frederick Whitfield had provided a full account of the previous evening, and that the torch taken from the gallery's equipment cupboard had been located in the wastepaper bin of the gallery's ground-floor cloakroom, and that the documents in the mirror were now in Inspector Doyle's official custody, the composed expression underwent a process that was interesting to observe. It did not shatter. It wasn't the expression of a man confronted by catastrophe, because Heinrich Hartmann was not a man whose expressions reflected his internal states accurately. But it changed, moved, rearranged itself into something that was at its foundation very tired. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, I want my solicitor. Of course, said Poirot. Inspector Doyle will assist you. He stepped back and let the formal processes of justice proceed. Chapter 8. After the Gala. The matter of Heinrich Hartmann proceeded through the legal machinery with the deliberate pace that serious matters required, and Poirot, whose involvement was of the consultative rather than the prosecutorial kind, watched it proceed from a comfortable distance, available when needed and occupied with other things when not. The documents from the Venetian mirror were authenticated within a fortnight by 3 independent experts, 2 of whom wept during the examination, not from sentimentality, but from the recognition of what they were looking at, which was the comprehensive written record of a system of theft conducted over 4 years against people who had had no protection from it. The documents named 67 transactions. They named the families. They named the works.
They named Heinrich Hartmann on 31 separate pages. The international dimensions of the case, the Austrian and German authorities, the families of the original owners scattered across 6 countries after 17 years of various forms of exile and displacement, would occupy lawyers and tribunals and restitution committees for years. Poirot understood this. He had.
By this point in his career, a realistic assessment of the speed at which justice operated when it was asked to operate across borders and decades. It was slow, it was imperfect. It was, nonetheless, the only mechanism available, and he respected it, with the specific respect that a man reserves for flawed things that are genuinely trying. Clara Voss remained in London for 3 weeks after the gala. Poirot saw her twice. Once when she came to Dover Street to give her formal statement to Inspector Doyle, and once a week after that when she appeared, without announcement, at Poirot's flat, where he was breakfasting, and sat down across from him with the ring still on her right index finger and the look of a woman who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. What she had to say was "thank you," and she said it in 3 sentences. Plainly, without ceremony or elaboration, in the manner of a person who has spent 3 years in motion and has, for the first time, arrived somewhere. "The documents," she said. "Ernst spent 2 years on them. He was not a hero, my husband. He was an ordinary man who found something and understood what it was and thought someone should do something about it. He didn't consider himself brave." She paused. "He was, of course." "Yes," said Poirot. "He was." She left. He watched her go down the street from his window and then returned to his breakfast with the composed satisfaction of a man who has done the work correctly and knows it. Frederick Whitfield did not close the gallery.
He spent 3 weeks after his father's death in what his solicitor described as an intensive review of the gallery's holdings, a process that Poirot understood to be rather more thorough than the legal minimum required, and which resulted in the voluntary surrender to the appropriate international body of 4 works in the Whitfield collection, whose provenance, under honest examination, did not bear scrutiny. This cost Frederick Whitfield a considerable sum of money and a degree of reputational discomfort that he seemed, to Poirot's observing eye, to regard as the correct price. Edith Crane stayed on as head of restoration and quietly became, over the following months, the closest thing the gallery had to a moral compass, a position for which she had not applied and which suited her precisely because she understood it to be a function of practice rather than authority. Jenkins, the night watchman, gave his statement, went home, returned to work the following Monday, and said nothing about any of it to anyone, which was, in Poirot's view, the kind of professional discretion that deserved its own form of recognition. Inspector Doyle came to see Poirot 6 weeks after the gala in the early evening, with a bottle of decent Bordeaux that he left on the desk and a case file that he placed beside it and referred to only briefly. "Hartmann's counsel is arguing diminished responsibility," he said. "They will not succeed," said Poirot. "No, the evidence is very clean." Doyle paused, looking at the bottle rather than at Poirot. "Frederick Whitfield's testimony, the business of the 90 seconds, the thought he had. His counsel is managing it, but it's there in the record." "It is there because Frederick Whitfield put it there," said Poirot, "of his own choice, without being asked." He opened the Bordeaux with the small corkscrew he kept in the top drawer. A man who confesses voluntarily to his worst impulse in a formal statement when he was not required to and when it did him no legal good, that man is not, I think, someone we need to worry about. Doyle accepted the wine. They sat for a moment in the comfortable silence of 2 professionals who have done a difficult thing well and are taking a moment to acknowledge it before moving on. "The mirror," said Doyle. "It's in evidence storage now." Eventually it goes back to the original estate, or what remains of it." "Good," said Poirot. He turned his glass and looked at the wine in the lamplight, deep red, catching the amber warmth of the room. "You know what I think about most when I consider this case?" Doyle raised an eyebrow. "The man who made the mirror frame," said Poirot. "In Venice, in the 18th century. He worked carefully. The frame is genuinely beautiful, the workmanship very fine. He was proud of it. And then, 150 years after he finished it, someone used it to hide stolen documents. He paused. He could not have imagined it, and yet here we are. Is there a conclusion in that observation? Said Doyle. Only that objects outlast the purposes to which they are put, said Poirot, and that this is, on balance, fortunate. Outside the window, Dover Street went about its evening. The lamplight fell across the wet pavement in the way it had been falling across London pavements for 100 years, indifferent to everything that had happened in the gallery at the eastern end of the street, which was closed tonight but would open again in the morning, with its paintings in their places, its new order of things in its quiet process of establishment, and its long history of being the kind of place that the city required in order to hold some portion of itself together. Poirot refilled both glasses. Les petites cellules grises rested, for now.